Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. I hope the week's going well. Let me start with macro thoughts and a question that the bond freak is asking. What the hell is going on? And this is around the amount of liquidity that the Fed is having to inject via repo operations, and this has been steadily growing since we had that big spike in interest rate, this big spike in repo rates a few weeks ago. He answers his own question to some degree. No one really seems to know. I've heard US Treasury issuance has finally saturated the market and the Fed has to fund it. I've heard the big banks, probably led by JP Morgan, are flexing their muscles against reserve regulations. I've heard everyone is avoiding a big name out there. Take your pick. Home thoughts. This is a great photograph from Northman Trader. Look back at St Paul's, London from Millennium Bridge. And it's perfectly created, isn't it? Given that there's this big Russia-Africa conference going on, it took me back to Pushkin. Pushkin was a great-grandson of Ibrahim Hannibal, who was born near Lake Chad, but captured as a boy and taken to Moscow. As President Putin hosts African leaders for the first Russia-Africa summit in Sochi on Wednesday and Thursday, here is a look at these connections, starting with the beloved 19th century poet Aleksander Pushkin, known as Russia's Moor. Pushkin lived from 1799 to 1837, was a rare mixed-race aristocrat in Tsarist-era St. Petersburg. Schoolchildren in Russia focus on reciting his poems rather than learning about his ancestry. Great-grandson of Ibrahim Hannibal, who was born near Lake Chad but captured as a boy and taken to Moscow, Hannibal was baptized and given the name Abraham and brought up in the Russian court, growing close to Tsar Peter the Great. He had a career in the military and was one of the first people to cultivate potatoes in Russia. Pushkin was curious about his African relative who died in 1781 in his 80s and dedicated a novel to him. Unfortunately, the work called The Moor of Peter the Great was never finished. A deception that elevates us is dearer than a host of low truths. I've lived to bury my desires and see my dreams corrode with rust. Now all that's left are fruitless fires that burn my empty heart to dust. Struck by the clouds of cruel fate, my crown of summer bloom is sere. Alone and sad I watch and wait and wonder if the end is near. As conquered by the last cold air, when winter whistles in the wind, alone upon a branch that's bare, a trembling leaf is left behind. My dreams, what has become of their sweetness? What indeed has become of my youth? And finally, upon the brink of the wild stream he stood and dreamt a mighty dream. He's a fabulous writer. His short stories are really worth reading. Political reflections. This is an astonishing document filled with revelations, among them this: the president may have insisted this wasn't a quid pro quo, but this is the definition of a quid pro quo. This is from Shane Harris. And that took me back to the end of December when I was quoting Murphy, who said this to the Washington Post. He's trapped, he's playing poker, holding 2 threes and suddenly putting all his chips in. It's pure emotion, the mark of a panicking amateur. Trump's real liability isn't impeachment, it's China and the economy. What the Trump administration has been doing so far vis-à-vis China is an own goal, ein Eigentor. This is Spengler in Asia Times. You have compared the situation that the US is facing toward China to the siege and conquest of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. The Mongols by themselves did not have the capability to penetrate the 12-foot thick walls of the city of Baghdad, but they hired 1,000 Chinese siege engineers. Within 3 weeks, the Chinese mercenaries breached the walls, at which point the Mongol horsemen went in and killed the entire population of Baghdad. Who are today's Chinese siege engineers who are breaching the American fortress? Huawei very much is the spearhead because in the Chinese model of economic expansion and the development of world economic power, broadband is the opener to everything else. Huawei, they produce the world's best smartphones, they certainly dominate 5G internet, but Huawei is not a Chinese company, it is an imperial company. The Chinese empire is doing better than us because it's absorbed the talent of a very large number of others. They have 50,000 foreign employees. I've collaborated with people from Huawei. I introduced them to foreign governments, was very clear about its objectives. They tell, for example, the government of Mexico, let us build a national broadband network. Once you get broadband, you get e-commerce, e-finance, then we'll supply the logistics and the financing for that, and we'll integrate you into the world market. US intelligence hasn't figured out what is going on. They're not catching up. 2 years ago, the US intelligence community realized that what 5G would do is not only give China a great deal of economic power, which by itself is a national security concern, but it would also, within the next several years, eliminate America's advantage in signals intelligence. The Chinese have pioneered a communications technique called quantum communications, which uses the entanglement of electrons at a distance to create a communication signal. The quantum system is such that if you interfere with it in any way, the signal disappears. So the result is America's ability to eavesdrop on everyone else will disappear in 2 or 3 years. All of a sudden, the screens will go dark at the National Security Agency. They will lose an enormous amount of power. And then saying the Chinese understanding is that every smartphone is a data gatherer. It'll gather data on health, on consumer transactions, on the environmental traffic patterns. All of this data can be uploaded onto the cloud. It can be processed by Chinese computers. And it can give China massive advantages in terms of industrial controls, health systems, the environment, urban planning, and of course social and political control. They want to have everybody in the world pay rent to the Chinese empire. You've called Trump's strategy of economically confronting China a failure. I think it has been a complete failure. I voted for Trump. I will almost certainly vote for Trump again. I would like to see him re-elected. But I'm distressed that he may be his own worst enemy. He ran on a platform of reviving American industry. American manufacturing is the weakest sector of the economy. And because his re-election depends on victory in several manufacturing states, I think his re-election is in greater jeopardy than it might have been. So I think the tariffs hurt. I've written severally about China and the US. Last article was 7th of October, China turned 70. That link is on Rich Wrap-Ups. End of last year, I said the trajectory of the tariff war is another pivotal curve to keep an eye on in 2019. I think that's easing up a bit as Trump looks to get some kind of accommodation ahead of next year's election. 9th of July 2018, I asked tariff wars, who blinks first? I made the comparison with Rebel Without a Cause and a Chickie run. 27th of May this year, I was reiterating how Xi Jinping was president for life. He's on a pedestal. It's a strongman conundrum. He is the only decider in China. 15th of October 2018, I was saying war is coming, and I was citing the example of the USS Decatur incident when a Chinese warship came within 45 yards of the Decatur in the South China Sea, and I call that a precursor. And then 10th of December 2018, I was writing about the truce dinner where the CFO from Huawei was subsequently arrested in Canada, and where I've speculated that some of that blackface influence operations against Justin Trudeau, probably the impulse emanated from that moment and her arrest. Asia Times is also saying Russia replaces US as Mideast power broker less than 48 hours after US troops were pelted with tomatoes and stones as they abandoned their former Kurdish allies in northeastern Syria. Russia has moved in as the region's new referee. I concluded by saying it's taken just 4 years. And I go back to an article I wrote in October 2015 when Putin stood up at UNGA and said, "I cannot help asking those who have caused the situation, do you realize now what you've done?" And within 24 hours of delivering that speech, Russia was intervening on the side of Bashar al-Assad. And I said then Putin fancies himself the flycatcher in Syria, the fly trap. And I said the speed of execution confirms that Russia is once again a geopolitical actor that will have to be considered, and I called it a breathtaking rebound, and 4 years later, here we are. Pepe Escobar, Vladimir Putin, Syria's pacifier-in-chief. Russia-Turkey deal establishes a safe zone along the Syrian-Turkish border, something Erdogan had been gunning for since 2014. There will be joint Russia-Turkey military patrols. YPG, part of the rebranded US-aligned Syrian Democratic Forces, will need to retreat and even disband, especially in the stretch between Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. This is a Syria-Russia-Turkey win-win-win, he's saying. Inevitably the end of a separatist-controlled Syrian Kurdistan, he added. He says, as he's argued for years, Syria to a large extent has been a key Pipelanistan war, not only in terms of pipelines inside Syria and the US preventing Damascus from commercializing its own natural resources, but most of all around the fate of the Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline, which was agreed in a memorandum of understanding signed in 2012. The pipeline has over the years always been a red line, not only for Washington, but also for Doha, Riyadh and Ankara. So that's another interesting point to take into mind. My article over the weekend was, of course, The New Economy of Anger. I'll just reiterate the Paul Virilio quote: "The revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production, but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine and itself becomes a motor, a machine of attack, in other words, a producer of speed." I said the phenomenon is spreading like wildfire. And I also was quoting Kapuscinski, who said revolution must be distinguished from revolt, coup d'etat, palace takeover. A coup or a palace takeover may be planned, but a revolution never. Its outbreak, the hour of that outbreak, takes everyone, even those who've been striving for it, unawares. They stand amazed at the spontaneity that appears suddenly and destroys everything in its path. It demolishes so ruthlessly that in the end it may annihilate the ideals that called it into being. I said this is a revolution, and it is a global phenomenon. I also quoted the other quote: "If the crowd disperses, goes home, does not reassemble, we say the revolution is over." It is not over. More and more people are gathering in the streets. From Chile to Lebanon, Protests flare over wallet issues. New York Times. In Chile, the spark was an increase in subway fares. In Lebanon, it was a tax on WhatsApp calls. The government of Saudi Arabia moved against hookah pipes. In India, it was about onions. Mass demonstrations in Bolivia, Spain, Iraq, Russia. Before that, Czech Republic, Algeria, Sudan, Kazakhstan. A steady drumbeat of unrest over the past few months. Many of the restive countries, experts discern a pattern, a louder than usual howl against elites in countries where democracy is a source of disappointment, corruption is seen as brazen, and a tiny political class lives large while the younger generation struggles to get by. It's young people who've had enough, said Ali Soufan. This new generation are not buying into what they see as the corrupt order of the political and economic elite in their own countries. They want to change. Then looking at Chile, where the president had boasted that his country was an oasis of stability in Latin America, we're ready to do everything to not fall into populism, into demagoguery, he said in an interview with the FT, and the next day protesters attacked factories, torched subway stations and looted supermarkets. Lebanon, Hariri survived the embarrassing revelations about a $16 million gift to a bikini model, which about sums it all up. Rate of protest has accelerated sharply of late as various factors have converged: a slowing global economy, dizzying gaps between rich and poor, and a youth bulge that in many countries has produced a restive new generation fizzing with frustrated ambition. So, what's interesting is this other point. Instead of calling for the head of a dictator, as many Arabs did in 2011, the Lebanese have indicted an entire political class. This is a photograph of protesters in Santiago on Sunday. The upheaval is the worst in the country in decades. This is a photograph of a mass demonstration in Beirut, Lebanon, and this goes back to Virilio's point. Another one, Steph Simanovitz tweeted in the last week: Bolivia, Lebanon, Chile, Spain, Catalonia, Hong Kong, Britain. In the last month, Iraq, Algeria, Egypt, Haiti, France. So we are in a very fragile situation. It feels very Gladwellian at the moment. And as I wrote in my piece, unless we're going to zing-yang everybody, we're now running on empty, and something's got to be done. Let's move on to the currency markets. Euro dollar 111.37, dollar index 97.439, Japanese yen 108.65, Swiss franc 0.9908, the pound getting a bit firmer 129.29, the Australian dollar 0.6842, India rupee 70.94, South Korean won 1173.27, Rial 403.43. We've seen a bit of a rally in the emerging market currencies. Egyptian pound 16.21 and the rand 14.66, coming towards the top of the range which it's been in for a while, which is 1450 to 1550. Dollar index, this is a chart from the market ear, looks as if that sort of bull channel is still intact. Euro dollar 111.37 last. The Chinese renminbi is at the strongest level since mid-September. This chart is from the market ear. Where are we now? 706.60. That's interesting. That's the strongest since mid-September, and it remains, as I've written separately, the most important currency to watch. Bitcoin, about which I wrote severally, but on the 30th of September, I said it's trading like everybody is long and it looks set to deteriorate. And I actually said it could fall as far as $1,000, where it was in January 2017. Not something the bulls really wanted to hear from me. But where are we now? We're at 7,405. According to Bloomberg, it's nearing a death cross indicator as US lawmakers target Libra. I'm not sure whether Libra is correlated to recent price weakness. This is another chart from FX Pip Titan, and he does produce some great charts, and I'm grateful to him. Apple leaves the world behind. That's from the market ear, and you can see it's outperforming just about everybody. Oil broke out yesterday, big surge, last trading at $55.60. It crossed the $55 level, which was important chart resistance. Gold, 1491.95, so that's still below 1500, and take your pick whether you think it's going to strengthen or go lower, but it's now trading in a narrower and narrower band. Let's move on to sub-Saharan Africa. This is the handshake. Putin in Africa. The Russian president opened a forum at the Russia-Africa summit. This is from Ivan 8848. It's a short video clip, but it's quite interesting. In this photograph, he's seen opening the Russia-Africa summit as well. This is from Lucien Kim. As I've said about him before, he is a geopolitical grandmaster. He's really picked his moment to step into Africa. You've got China retreating, short of cash. You've got, this is a big opportunity, I think, and it's really, they're putting a lot of effort into it. And he has a model which has a tremendous return on investment. It really does. December 2016, I was writing about a parabolic Putin rebound, and I think this is part of that. He had interfered in the US election. I said he had Fortress Europe surrounded. He was the intellectual father of the new zeitgeist that propelled Brexit, Le Pen, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. I said in the Middle East it also kind of pocketed OPEC, amongst other things. P. Stronsky in a thread, just click on that link, emboldened by a series of tactical gains in the Middle East, the Kremlin is turning its sights on Africa. How serious a challenge is this new effort, he asks. He calls it late to the party, Russia's return to Africa. Talks about how the USSR provided economic aid and security ties to African states and liberation movements during the Cold War. And I think that legacy provides more than a limited springboard, which is what Stronsky's calling it for Russia today. Saying Russia's clout on the continent doesn't remotely compare with the influence the USSR once enjoyed. I'm not sure. I think that clout is increasing quite fast, in point of fact. Russian mercenaries show the Kremlin's risk appetite is small. It doesn't want to use Russia's regular militaries, but mercenaries which use self-financing mechanisms, mining rights to sustain military deployments. Well, it's working perfectly. It's capitalism of a Russian type, and it's working. The returns are 100 to 1, if not more. I like this photograph that Charlie Robertson, the global economist at Renaissance Capital, posted from the summit with the various military hardware, and bear in mind that that's a significant component of Russia-Africa trade. Between 2006 and 2018, Russia's trade with Africa increased by 335%, more than both China's and India's. It's now Africa's leading supplier of arms, signed at least 20 military cooperation agreements, which it uses to extract mining rights for gold, diamonds, and other minerals. Russia in Africa, very interesting article, Warsaw Institute, weapons, mercenaries, and spin doctors. And that's about sums it right up. Russia's clout on African soil runs on many tracks. Its expansion is geared primarily towards hybrid activities. In Moscow's offer for Africa are mercenaries, military equipment, mining investments, nuclear power plants, and railway connections. The Russian military specialists help those politicians that show a pro-Russian attitude. Regards Africa as an important active participant in the emerging polycentric architecture of the world order and an ally in protecting international law against attempts to undermine it. Well worth reading that article in full as well. Here you see His Majesty the King Maswati III Dlamini arriving in Sochi to take part in the Russia-Africa Summit. Does Africa need Russia? The first ever Russia-Africa Summit. This is Andrew Korybiko. Moscow invaluably fills the much-needed niche of providing its partners with democratic security, or in other words, the cost-effective and low-commitment capabilities needed to thwart colour revolutions and resolve unconventional wars, collectively referred to as hybrid war. To simplify, Russia's political technologists have reportedly devised bespoke solutions for confronting incipient and ongoing colour revolutions, just like its private military contractors have supposedly done the same when it comes to ending insurgencies, the latter of which has been powerfully on display in the CAR. Basically, Russian military advisors, armed shipments and PMC trainers succeeded in stopping a civil war that was bordering on genocide, despite the rest of the world having lost hope this could happen. I imagine Putin bringing up a photo of Gaddafi and saying, a dead Gaddafi, and saying this can happen to you, and showing them a photograph of Bashar looking through his binoculars at the border in Turkey and says, or this, take your pick. And I know which pick everyone's going to take. Tensions rise between Ethiopia and Egypt over the use of the Nile. A dispute over the use of the water in the River Nile has raised tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia, threatening to provoke a new crisis in relations as Addis Ababa nears completion of the continent's biggest hydroelectric project in the Ethiopian highlands. Egyptian officials said Addis Ababa's plans would give Ethiopia unfettered control over the flow of the river, a lifeline for 100 million Egyptians, threatening their nation's already scarce water supplies. Egypt wants to have veto power, telling Ethiopia what it can do, said Gebre, the Ethiopian ambassador to London. A linchpin of Ethiopia's economic development plans at its peak will generate more than 6,000 megawatts of electricity, helping extend power to the 65 million Ethiopians who still live without electricity. Ethiopia wants to fill the reservoir within 4 years. Egypt wants a slower pace that can be varied in response to droughts. What Egypt wants is to make Ethiopia its hydrological colony, said Zeru Nabebe Yigzor. So we've got quite a sensitive situation there that the Nobel Prize winner's got to deal with. Here you see a fisherman on the Nile near Cairo. Egypt depends on the river for almost all of its water, 97%. Look at this, African currencies year to date, Egyptian pound, the big outperformer. South African all share up 5.37% year to date. Dollar versus rand, 14.66. If it breaks 14.50, that's a bull move all the way to 13. Egyptian pound, here's another chart, 16.1551. That continues to make up good ground. EGX 30 up 8.37% year to date. Nigerian all share down 16.01% year to date. Ghana Stock Exchange down 13.74% year to date. The EIB has cancelled a 19.5 billion shilling Centum geothermal loan. The story is there on rich wrap-ups. The Nairobi all shares up 6.43% year to date, and the NSE 20 is down 12.5% year to date. Thank you for stopping by.